So let's start. 3 o'clock Paris time. Good morning, good afternoon to the more than 500 registered participants to the launch of this first OECD global report on civic space. My name is Alessandro Bellantoni. I have the pleasure of being your moderator today, and I'm also the host, the head of the OECD Open Government and Civic Space Unit here at the OECD. Let me also start by thanking the speakers that have joined us today. I will introduce them one by one as I'll give them the floor, but thank you very much for being with us. As you probably know, at the OECD, through the Working Party on Open Government, we have been working on how to integrate the principles of integrity, transparency, accountability, and stakeholder participation into public sector reforms for many, many years. And within this context, civic space has always been considered a crucial precondition for open government, for good governance, and more recently, for democracy. And Gillian will tell you more about this in a second. And it is for this reason that almost 3 years ago, in November 2019, we have established the OECD Observatory of Civic Space to identify barriers, analyze trends, and ultimately support countries in their attempts to promote and protect civic space. In this work, we have benefited enormously from the support of our advisory group, and many of its members and funders are here with us today online as speakers. Thank you very much. Now, today it's a strange day for us because on the one hand, it's a day of celebration. Our mandate when we first started discussing the idea of working on civic space was to bring the voice and the data from governments into the broader discussion on how to promote and protect civic space that so far had been dominated, I would say, from important reflections from mostly civil society, non-governmental actors. And I think we have succeeded in doing that. And Claire will tell you more about the data that we have verified and then we bring to this table, to this conversation from governments. But it's also a day of concern because you will see the results of our report. While they show a lot of innovations and good practices, they also show a lot of areas where much more needs to be done. But this will be much more and much better expressed by the speakers, to whom I give the floor in a second. Let me just remind you the usual house rules that I would say after COVID and 2 years of online meetings, everybody knows, but I'll invite participants to join the conversation by writing their questions in the Q&A button that you will see at the bottom of your screen. But also please use the chat functions to have more general comments and conversations among you. Obviously, I'll ask the speakers to unmute themselves before they speak, but then mute themselves back when they stop. And I also remind everybody that this event is recorded and we will publish it on the website of the OECD. Also, please know that there is a French interpretation available, and therefore every intervention can be made either in English or in French. And then we'd like to monitor the conversation also on social media. So please use the hashtag @CivicSpace throughout the webinar, whatever social media you'll be using, so that we can track the conversations and use them for future reports. But now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to pass the floor to my colleague, Gillian Turner, the Deputy Director of the Public Governance Directorate of the OECD, for the opening remarks. Gillian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you to all of you for joining us here today. The team had suggested that I start by saying that I'm very pleased to be here, but actually I'm absolutely delighted to be here for what is a very significant moment for the OECD. And actually it's for 3 reasons. The first reason is that this is the launch of the first ever global report on civic space, which I think is no small thing. Second, because I have been able to see the huge amount of hard work that has gone in to getting this report over the line, particularly by Claire McAvoy and by Nies Davrim. It's the culmination of over 2 years of data collection, validation and research by the OECD Observatory of Civic Space, which couldn't have happened without the support and commitment of the 52 countries mentioned within it and the foundations that generously supported the work. The third reason that I'm absolutely delighted to be opening this launch event is that actually the Civic Space Report is the first key deliverable coming out of the OECD's new Reinforcing Democracy initiative. This was an initiative that was kicked off probably over 18 months ago now by OECD member countries. And in fact, it's an incredibly significant thing. It was basically OECD member countries stepping up and saying, look, we absolutely need to do something about the state of our own democracies, even the most well-established democracies. We see that there are areas of weakness, areas of backsliding, and something needs to be done at a global level. We're incredibly proud to say that we held the first global forum on building trust and reinforcing democracy in Luxembourg in November, which many of you will have participated in, as well as a ministerial event of the Public Governance Committee to discuss these important issues. I don't think I need to say why it's so important that we have this initiative. Low levels of trust, low voter turnout in many countries, many people disengaging from democratic processes. I could go on. Much of this is also supported by some of the data that we have from the recently published OECD survey on drivers of trust in public institutions. That report, which is essentially a perception survey of well over 55,000 people in 22 OECD countries, shows that there are many people in OECD countries that feel that they do not have a voice. I think the figure is that only 3 in 10 actually feel that they have a say in what their government is doing. And therefore, this report on civic space is perfect to be the first deliverable coming out of this initiative. It actually falls under one of the key pillars of the initiative. There are 5. The first pillar is around mis and disinformation, which actually does come into this report as well. The second, though, which this report falls under, is around citizen participation, representation, and openness. I think that the prerequisite that civic space is for allowing that to happen is incredibly important. And I think this report will go a long way to supporting our ambition on the Reinforcing Democracy initiative going forward. So turning to the specifics of the report itself, why do we need to defend civic space? It's absolutely crucial. I don't think many of you here will not need to be convinced of this, but countries that foster civic space at both the national and local levels are much better placed to reap the benefits of citizen engagement, strengthen transparency and accountability, and empowered citizens and civil society. It allows governments to better respond to citizens' needs, very simply. It provides an opportunity for governments to engage with citizens, to listen to them, to build that all-important trust that is necessary for governments to be able to drive forward reforms and to make them a success. And it facilitates wider participation in public affairs, which is an absolutely fundamental right in a democracy. So the aims of the report. The purpose of this global report is based on survey data from 52 countries, of which 33 are OECD members, and it is to support countries to raise standards while suggesting a wide range of measures to safeguard civic space. We found that while the foundations for civic space are strong in many countries, no countries are immune to pressures and challenges. For example, among others, we've documented crackdowns on peaceful assembly, harassment against journalists and activists, restrictive laws governing civil society, and limitations on media freedom of expression and access to information. And this includes in OECD countries as well. All in all, a thriving civic space can only emerge through the combined efforts of a range of actors, including public institutions, civil society, and citizens. It requires constant ongoing attention, as the evidence shows that it can be easily undermined both through action and inaction. The OECD Observatory of Civic Space stands ready to support countries to have a frank discussion about the challenges they face and to find solutions together with civil society with a view to raising standards in members and like-minded partner countries. I'm sure you're going to have an excellent discussion here today, and I very much look forward to working with many of you in this area going forward, not only on Civic Space, but also on the wider Reinforcing Democracy initiative. I hope you have an excellent discussion, and thank you for listening to me. Back to you, Alessandro.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And thank you for underlining the historic moment where this report is being published, when the OECD is really turning its attention and the attention of its members to the key building blocks of democracy, of which, of course, civic space is one. So within this context, it is obviously with great pleasure that I give the floor now to Claire and Denise from the OECD Observatory of Civic Space, to give you a sense of what are the key findings of this report. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. So we're going to spend the next 15 plus minutes just taking you through, giving you a sense of the breadth of this research and taking you through some of our key findings and also our recommendations. So this is the first global report on civic space, as we've heard. And the report focuses on the protection of civic space as a precondition for civil society and citizen participation in public affairs or public life. And it's based on a survey of OECD member countries and other countries that opted into the process. Crucially, as Alessandro mentioned, it brings the voice of governments into ongoing debates on civic space, which are largely dominated by non-governmental actors or civil society. And crucially also, all of the data that was provided to us during the 2-year data gathering process was validated by the OECD. As a complement to the government data that we present in the report, we also draw extensively on data and analysis from external sources, such as CSOs, research institutes, and academics. And in particular, in relation to implementation of various laws. And it's there, of course, that we find many challenges. So by comparing government data on the one hand and external data on the other, we were able to identify where there are positive trends and strengths, areas to build on, and of course also where standards need to be raised. In addition, the report provides extensive guidance to countries on strengthening their alignment with international standards on civic space, specifically standards from the OECD, from the United Nations Human Rights System, from special rapporteurs, and of course also guidance from regional bodies and court systems. And we'll return to the specific recommendations that came out of the process shortly. So here you have, on the next slide, you have a list of the countries that took part in the survey, to whom we are extremely grateful because it was a lengthy one. So we have 33 OECD members who took part and 19 non-members who opted in. And the survey questions themselves focused on the legal and policy and institutional frameworks in countries to promote and protect civic space, as well as their practices. The main content for the report was developed throughout 2021 and up until March 2022. And as part of this process, we were extremely happy and privileged to partner with a number of organizations who provided content for the report, some of whom we're delighted to have with us here today, namely RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières, the International Centre for Not-for-Profit Law, the European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. And I'd like to welcome those partners to this launch. So here on the next slide, you can see the broad areas that we tackle in this report. You'll see there are 4 main themes, one on each of the colored petals on the screen. So we looked at civic freedoms, access to information, media freedoms, and civic space in the digital age. And by that, we mean online civic space, and then the enabling environment for civil society. And under each of these themes, we broke it down and examined a whole range of sub-themes and provide guidance on all of them. Issues around discrimination, inequality, participation, inclusion, and indeed COVID-19 are mainstreamed throughout the report as cross-cutting themes. Before we get into the actual key findings from the report. Just a note on the broad context for civic space right now in OECD countries. So as we already heard from Gillian, the context is complex. It's evolving, and it's actually very mixed across countries, within countries, and even within the public sectors of countries. Many OECD members occupy top rankings in international indices related to dimensions of civic space. Others score lower in particular areas, and some score low in a whole range of areas. Our research shows that civic space is being influenced by a wide range of factors, both internal and external. These range from obviously COVID-19 and the related emergency measures, changing demographics, fears about migration, increased polarization in many countries, inequality, and the lack of trust in public authorities. But there are also factors such as outdated laws, vaguely worded policies and laws, particularly in areas to do with security and counterterrorism and national politics. And these are also playing a role or these are also impacting how countries protect their civic space or not. Data from the Varieties of Democracy Institute shows a decline in about 20% of OECD members in areas related to democracies and civil liberties over the last decade. And data from Civicus also shows a decline in about 20% of OECD countries since 2018. In 2022, civic space was considered open in 42% of the OECD's 38 member countries. So with that broad context in mind, I will now hand over to Denise Devrim, my colleague, who will tell you a bit more about our findings.
Thank you, Claire. Let me now share some more findings with you. On the next slide, you can see that data show that the foundations for the protection of civic space, namely legal and institutional frameworks governing the freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association, are well established and relatively strong in respondent countries, as earlier mentioned by Gillian. For example, most of the survey respondents grant these civic freedoms to all persons present in a country. So this also covers persons that are temporarily or irregularly in a given country. You can see on the first three infographics, starting from the left, the percentages related to the data I just mentioned. There are also strong legal frameworks countering discrimination in most countries that responded to the survey. These include laws on affirmative action to support disadvantaged groups. Most countries also seek to protect civic freedoms through publicly funded independent institutions and complaint mechanisms to counter violations. This is the last infographic on this slide. But data also show that in some instances, legal frameworks are not in line with international standards. And in addition, there are implementation challenges in most countries. Defamation laws, for example, require particular attention. As you may be aware, these are a balancing exercise between freedom of speech on the one hand and protecting personal reputations on the other, even though international standards in this area clearly recognize that criminalizing defamation can lead to censorship and self-censorship among journalists and activists, for example, and recommend civil remedies, most surveyed countries still continue to criminalize defamation and foresee prison sentences. These are the first three infographics that you see on the slide. In addition, some countries have outdated laws governing freedom of expression, often offering special protection to heads of state, for example. It is, of course, very important that laws don't offer special protection to the reputations of heads of state so that civil society can scrutinize the actions of public officials and hold them to account. Even though such laws are hardly implemented in the countries. Nearly 40% of countries still have these provisions in place. I would say this is a good example of an area where countries need to update their laws. And as we can see, civic space can also be affected by inaction as well as action. Data from CSO rankings, such as Article 19's Freedom of Expression Index, show that freedom of expression is also under pressure in practice in some countries, with greater challenges for non-OECD respondents. Implementation challenges also include new broad anti-terrorism and security legislation, as mentioned by Claire earlier, in some countries, with potentially negative effects on freedom of speech. When such legal frameworks are overly broad, this can have the effect of silencing speech and legitimate reporting. Attacks against human rights defenders are another challenge in some countries. States that are particularly affected may have programs to protect human rights defenders, but a variety of challenges, including lack of resources or absent rule of law, mean that they are unable to adequately protect them. As regards freedom of assembly, legal frameworks in respondent countries are mostly in line with international standards, with some exceptions. For example, while international guidance suggests that blanket restrictions in certain locations or designated perimeters around areas where assemblies are not allowed should be avoided, survey data show that laws in certain countries do actually indicate public spaces where it is not permissible to hold assemblies, or where assemblies are only permissible in certain circumstances or at certain times of the day. In practice, insufficient protection of protesters by law enforcement, as well as police violence used against protesters, has been documented in a number of countries. The pie chart that you see on the bottom from a VDEM indicator on freedom of assembly shows that in a number of countries, this right is not always facilitated. The report includes a detailed section on press freedom in OECD countries from Reporters Without Borders, and I'm sure that Thibaut will tell us more shortly. Press freedom has seen a significant decline around the world, with rising vilification, violence, and harassment of journalists. Data show that while the overall picture in OECD countries is relatively good compared to the rest of the world, it has deteriorated in recent years. Even though countries have passed measures to protect journalists recently, threats, imprisonment, and killings represent a growing concern. As you can see at the bottom of this slide, between 2017 and 21, 67 journalists were killed in respondent countries, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. In the digital era, online freedom of expression is increasingly under threat, and two areas that we discuss in the report are online hate speech and mis- and disinformation. There is an emerging consensus among governments, technology companies, and civil society on the need to consider new policy and regulatory frameworks that protect individuals and society from the unchecked spread of hateful content and facilitate the flow of factual information while also preserving users' freedom of expression. The survey data that you can see on this slide show that governments have started a wide range of activities to combat online hate. These include measures such as national strategies, government-led task forces, awareness campaigns, targeted trainings of public officials. The two areas where most measures took place are publication of data on hate speech and support for victims of hate speech. Only very few countries have introduced regulations on content moderation and reporting requirements for social media platforms. As regards mis- and disinfo, at least 4 respondents adopted new legislation recently, raising again concerns as prohibitions are often based on overly broad and vague language or concepts. The last 3 slides will present some of the data on the enabling environment for CSOs, which is comparatively robust in OECD members, where CSOs are largely free to operate to criticize the government without fear of harassment, according to data from VDEM. Again, but of course, there are exceptions to this. And as Claire said, it is always necessary to look beyond rankings and indices to understand limitations on civic space. Good practices include national strategies to support the CSO sector, which are in place in a majority of OECD countries. OECD governments also protect the enabling environment for civil society in partner countries, with approximately half having a strategy to promote CSOs as part of development cooperation. There are a number of other good practices detailed in the report, including simplification of CSO registration procedures, financial support during COVID-19, and tax exceptions for CSOs, for example. There is, of course, a wide range of ways in which the work of CSOs can be hindered, whether intentionally or unintentionally. For example, rules and practices around the registration of CSOs can hinder their work. Our research shows that administrative requirements for registration remain burdensome in a number of countries, in addition to the length of time it takes to register. For example, you can see on the second infographic, in 1/3 of OECD countries, it takes more than 1 month to register, and in some, it can take up to 1 year. We have also gathered data on the entities that are responsible for CSO registration, as this can send a powerful message about how the state views the sector. The data that you can see on the first infographic on this slide shows that in 1/4 of OECD members, ministries of interior are in charge, which can lead to an association between the CSO sector and security risks, given that these entities are also responsible for investigating crimes and protecting national security. Legal frameworks in some respondents may also make it difficult for CSOs to engage on political matters. This is the infographic in the middle. In nearly 1/3 of OECD members, laws restrict political engagement for public benefit organizations, while very few restrict it for all types of CSOs. Another existing challenge for CSOs are smear campaigns. Data from the EU Agency on Fundamental Rights shows that 31% of surveyed CSOs report negative media campaigns, and 26% of surveyed CSOs report coordinated multiple online threats. Another challenge are strategic lawsuits against public participation, known as SLAPs, which is an area which has not received major attention yet from countries in terms of legal protection at national level. Here comes the last slide on our selected data. A favorable financial environment for CSOs is a key pillar of the enabling environment for CSOs. Access to government funding is generally seen as a significant challenge. Our data show that long-term and core funding remain rare, and that short-term funding continues to be the most common funding modality. So basically what this shows is that funding modalities that support the strengthening of the capacity of the sector are rare. Data from the EU Fundamental Rights Agency shows that 52% of CSOs surveyed reported that they encountered difficulties because of competition with other CSOs about limited funds. Government data on funding for CSOs is scattered and very often lacking, even in countries that generously support the sector. And this, of course, hinders a strategic approach to supporting the sector. In addition, national security and counterterrorism laws have a tangible impact on the financial sustainability of CSOs. The pie chart on the right shows that 20% of respondents impose restrictions to receive funding from abroad. In countries where government and private funding is limited or unavailable, foreign or international funding can, of course, be a valuable lifeline for CSOs. So this is the data that we selected for this presentation. Obviously, in the report, you can find a lot more data on all of these issues. And let me now hand back to Claire again, who will guide you through the recommendations.
Thank you, Denise. So for each of these areas and many more that Denise mentioned, we provide detailed guidance for countries on measures to consider taking. And we group these together under the 10 high-level recommendations here that you see on your screen. So the measures respond to the specific challenges that were mentioned, things like restrictions on freedom of expression, both online and offline, violence and harassment targeting journalists and human rights defenders, the restrictions on peaceful assembly that we just heard about, insufficient protection of protesters, the lack of protection for minorities in many countries, and then the slaps, the smear campaigns, the restricted space for CSOs engaging on issues such as the environment and migration in some countries, and also restrictions on their activities and their funding. So in addition to these high-level recommendations, which cover basic rights, let me just highlight a couple of others. Number 3 there focuses on countering the discrimination and exclusion that we view as acting as an obstacle to equal participation in public life, and that we find in every country. And this is a central theme in the report. Number 5, crucially focuses on fostering what we call a public interest information ecosystem. And that is a place with independent media and access to information, access to factual information, including from public authorities. And number 8 focuses on protecting civic space, not just domestically, but also as part of development cooperation, given that so many OECD members are major donors. So the report advocates basically is in favor of countries adopting a comprehensive whole of government approach to protecting civic space that is coordinated across the public sector. If we could just have the next slide. And a central conclusion of the report is that, in fact, all countries would benefit from an ongoing review of the manner in which legal frameworks governing civic space are implemented, and also a review of relevant legislation to ensure it is not restricting civic space. And crucially, that this is essential for our democracies. As you have heard, the OECD has launched a Reinforcing Democracy initiative and will continue to monitor civic space protection in member and partner countries at regular intervals as part of the work of the OECD Observatory of Civic Space. So thank you very much for listening to our key findings, and sincere thanks to the foundations who made this work possible, namely the Ford Foundation, Open Society Foundations, and the Robert Bosch Foundation. Back to Alessandra.
Thank you very much, Claire and Denise. I hope that participants got a sense of the depth and breadth of the report, which of course I will not even try to summarize, but do please read it. And if you don't want to read the full report, please have a look at the highlights that we have produced. They really summarize the main findings and recommendations. I know that colleagues have been putting the link in the chat. It's available starting from today. So both of them are available starting from today. So please download them, read them, and especially we hope that you will use them in your advocacy at the country level. 3 quick things before passing the floor to our speakers. Clearly, the message is that liberal democracies do better in promoting and protecting civic space, but they are not immune to backsliding, hence the importance of the Reinforcing Democracy initiative of the OECD and the work of the observatory that Claire just mentioned that will continue to monitor trends and highlight good practices and areas for improvement. And the other aspect I really care about, when I launched this event, I said that the report, we see the report as a platform, as a way to add the government perspective to an ongoing conversation. And that is why in the report, you will find also contribution from Reporters Without Borders, the EU, Fundamental Rights Agency, UN is extensively mentioned. So please see these again, as I said, as a contribution to a broader conversation where each of you can bring a piece to find the solution or the best way to promote and protect civic space. And I'm really thrilled to see that people from in the chat come from all over the world and all sorts of institutions and walk of life. So let me again remind you, first of all, that you can write and speak in English and French. Do use the question and answer button to ask questions as you're doing to our speakers, and continue to use the chat to have conversation and share documents among you. Now, with the greatest pleasure, I'd like to introduce Clément Nialezossi-Voulet, the Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association of the United Nations. I mentioned the United Nations as extensively being included in the report, and we are thrilled to have Clément with us today. Clément, the floor is yours to share with us your reflection on this important topic.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, and my greetings to all of you who are joining us online today, and to my fellow panelists. I thank the OECD for inviting me to provide remarks at this event. I also wish to congratulate them on producing this important report, which comes at a critical time where, more than ever, we must be vigilant to ensure that human rights that allow civic space to flourish are respected and protected. As this report echoes, civil society is crucial for the protection and promotion of human rights, development, democracy, and peace. Today, civil society organizations across the world are involved in every aspect of peace building, from conflict prevention to peace negotiation and transitional justice. Many CSC take on roles that political actors are often unable to due to their independence and impartiality, as well as their connection to grassroots constituency and greater trust with local population. Civil society group consisting of and working with an era of marginalized group have made tremendous progress in highlighting disenfranchisement and protecting rights. Such group and individuals also play a key role in documenting human rights violation and protecting the exercise of fundamental freedom. Since being appointed as the special rapporteur, I have seen innumerable examples of civil society power to peacefully progress democratic values. As we face multiple conflicts, continual problems stemming from COVID-19, climate disaster, and economic despair, we need more solidarity and more groups with the courage to offer rescue and promote dialogue to solve these issues, making civic space as important as ever. Sadly, despite the achievement of civil society, I have observed since the past 10 years that it is under intensified attack and continue to be misconstructed as a threat to stability and subordinate to concern of national security and public order. This is part of a global trend of a decline in democratic freedoms and the rise of authoritarianism. This OECD report also highlights some of these concerns. I share many of these report observations. COVID-19 posed unprecedented challenges to human rights globally, including to civic space. The pandemic further proved, as noted in the OECD report, how essential digital technology are to protecting civic space. Digital technologies indeed serve as a virtual space where groups facing restriction to operating physically could form online assemblies and associations without fear of reprisal. While some states adopted human rights approach in dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, others used this crisis to damage civic space, both online and offline, through the adoption of sweeping emergency law and measure to rule by decree, and a rise in a new law that give broad power to law enforcement. The trends found in the reports that such measures in surveyed states are ending is encouraging, but we must remain observant to ensure such temporary measures do not become permanent, and that we learn from the lesson of COVID-19 for the next crisis. I encourage states and other stakeholders to review my September 2022 joint declaration with regional human rights mechanism on protecting the right to freedom of peaceful assembly in time of emergencies, which contain key principles and recommendations for such situation. I share the concern highlights in the report in terms of hate speech and misinformation in digital space and the harms this cause for civil society. Given my mandate, I'm especially concerned by the rise of smear campaign and online abuse of association and their members, including groups focused on marginalized community. Civil society and their members must be supported and protected from such treatment. My 2019 report on freedom of association and peaceful assembly in digital space also provide important guidance and recommendation on how to combat this problem. While many states permit and facilitate peaceful assembly, I agree with the report finding that lack of protection of protesters by law enforcement as well as police violence used against protesters in some contexts raise serious concern about respect for the right to protest. I have recently published and raised my concern about such violence in some of the most acute situations at present, but I'm also concerned by an emerging trend, including in some of the OECD member states, of law that restricts protests, in particular protests by individuals raising their alarm about climate change. I welcome that the report finds OECD state surveys are creating a strong environment for civil society, and that many of these states are also working to assist the promotion of a similar environment in other states. However, I'm also concerned by law in certain countries that aim to control and restrict the work of civil society, including through registration or authorization requirements, burdensome administrative demands, and restriction on accessing resources to carry out their legitimate activity. Finally, let me also say that I welcome the recommendation made in the OECD report to improve the situation of civic space globally, especially those on the need to protect and facilitate freedom of assembly, expression, and the right to protect online civic space as a digital platform for peaceful assembly, to foster an enable environment for civil society, and to systematically protect and promote civic space to allow everyone to engage in public decision-making. In this sense, I would like also to emphasize here that the role of law enforcement is important in this context. This is why I welcome the recent resolution of the UN Human Rights Council asking my mandate to produce practical tools for law enforcement on how to facilitate the exercise of the right to assembly in such context. Thank you very much, and congratulations again for this important report.
Thank you very much, Clément, for contextualizing the recommendations of the report from the broader perspective, of course, of the UN and from your particular point of view. Pour les collègues francophones, on est en train de s'occuper de la question de la traduction.
We are working on the issue interpretation. We are working on this technical issue as soon as possible.
I'm happy to pass the floor on a video recorded message from one of our key partners who unfortunately could not be with us, but has been with us as an institution very closely throughout the production of the report. We have a video message from Michael O'Flaherty, the director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event. I apologize that it has to be by means of a recorded statement. I would very much have liked to join you live. Let me at the outset congratulate the OECD on this important report, your first on the state of civic space, pressures on civil society. The report is very timely. It comes at a moment when we're acknowledging that our civic space is under pressure everywhere, not far away, not in some other territory, some other country, but right here in each of our societies. That pressure is compounded by the impact of COVID and, more importantly, of responses to COVID over the past few years. It comes at a time when we have to acknowledge the extent to which our rule of law is under threat. Our democracies themselves are challenged. Both points, of course, which were made so forcefully in recent weeks in reports of, on the one hand, international IDEA, and on the other of the World Justice Project. I'm struck by the extent to which your Civic Space report complements the findings, analysis and findings of the reports that we produce annually here at the Fundamental Rights Agency on the issue within the context of the EU. And what I find particularly striking is the extent to which we reach the same findings from different directions. You come primarily through data generated by governments. We produce our annual reports primarily with data provided by civil society, and ultimately we're saying the same thing. I'm also very appreciative of the content of your report, not just the conclusions, but also that vast repository of data, which we will all find invaluable as we go forward. I acknowledge with respect the recommendations that you're putting out, clear, sharp, to the point, and all of them smart. And finally, I acknowledge the extent to which, in describing the issues and the problems as all of government issues and problems, you, through your consultations, have engaged all of government. You've done an important job of waking the breadth of government up to its need to stand up for civil society. I very much look forward to our working together as we go forward, together, of course, hand in hand with our member states and our governments, but also with our civil societies. I undertake here today to continue the commitment of the Fundamental Rights Agency in this area. We will continue to support our 900 organisations strong fundamental rights platform, our space within which we engage with civil society. I commit to continuing the series of annual reports, health checks, if you will, on the state of civil society in the EU. And of course, we will continue to provide all possible support to civil society, to our member states, and to EU institutions to protect this essential dimension of our thriving democracies. Thank you.
Thanks again to FRA for all their support. And obviously it's again comforting but also preoccupying that the analysis and the recommendation coincide. Means that clearly the problems that civil society identifies are confirmed by the data that we received and verified from governments. So clearly there is a path forward that we need to walk, and it's clear, it's in front of us. Hopefully the report also suggests some of the solutions, looking at those countries that are perhaps doing better in this field. But I cannot imagine a better person to give us the perspective of civil society and non-governmental actors than Thibault Broutin, l'Assistant Director General from Reporters Without Borders. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today, also digitally. What I must say is that I've been very impressed by the 297 pages of the report that I've been able to look at. This is a landmark report for OECD and the Observatory. It's also, I think, the beginning of a new partnership between RSF, a press freedom organization, very internationally organized, but based in France, with OECD, based on the sharing of data. We've been very private, selfish with our data, and this is one of the first times we share it openly with an institution. And I must say that we're very happy by the use that's being done. I'd like to concentrate on two dimensions. First, the place in the report that's given to the problems of the press, of the journalists. The journalists are even described as an at-risk group, it must be a very disturbing thought for some journalists to be considered an at-risk group, but is definitely what the data evidences. What we consider is that, from the perspective of my organization, the situation in OECD countries is, of course, good, and it has deteriorated significantly. You will see, if you look in the larger report, there is a chart that is really self-evident, where you see a switch where OECD countries were mostly into the good situations in terms of press freedom, and they switched to fairly good. So I'm not saying that the OECD is performing badly in terms of press freedom. We're just thinking that it has deteriorated. It could do better in terms of press freedom protection. And if you look at the rankings, which is the most obvious entry into the World Press Freedom Index that's published by RSF, you don't get this sense that you get in this report here, that there is a global degradation of the scores. So it's really important to see that this degradation must be faced. The latest figures published by RSF this week on journalists imprisoned, about journalists being harassed, are also another additional concern. We see that there's a pattern. It implies a change in public policies, but it also sometimes implies a change within the behavior of political figures, which who might engage in the public vilification of journalists. So we have to revert this trend, and that's my second remark. We can't do that without assessing the problems associated with technological transformation. The report cleverly, acutely points out the need for a public interest information system. And I think the challenges of the press, of free media, which are so important to the question of civic space, must be addressed as part of a larger problem about the way national regulation and international frameworks are failing today in large parts to regulate the digital space. We see a change in the behaviors of government. I don't want to sound too dark about there, but we see that actors are acting in a very rogue way in the digital space. The Twitter story that was out this morning is really disturbing in that regard, and shows that not only there is a need to strengthen national regulation, but also to build something that's really relevant and efficient internationally. I'm also very happy to see, and this is not something RSF contributed, so I'm even more happy to see that, a segment dedicated to artificial intelligence. This is one of the key challenges of the digital space and of the civic space. I invite you all to test some of the tools that are on the market today and enable you to produce and also disseminate AI-generated content. Those are going to compete with journalism in the coming years, and it's very reassuring to see OECD countries taking measures, thinking about it. The OECD itself as an institution, I know, is working on it. It's a key challenge, and the fact that it is one of the elements of this report is really important. I'd like to end by saying that this report has been presented in a very brief way, but you will see that the data is excellent. It's really rich, but the recommendations are also there for you to review, for you to advocate for. The report is positioned, I would say, in a very positive or maybe diplomatic approach, which is the protection and promotion of civic space. It's not about shrinking public space, even though this is something that we can witness or testify of, but it's a report that's designed, in my perspective, to trigger action. So I think in the coming years, what the wish I would like to make for this community is really to become not only experts in problems, but experts in solution. And journalists are at the forefront of the fight to protect and promote the civic space. They are sometimes the first victims when the civic space is attacked. RSF and its sister organization, the Forum on Information and Democracy, are here to help all stakeholders to design and implement solutions. And I think the contribution that we've made to this report is, I think, an example of how a civil society organization can contribute to the work done by such an important organization that OECD. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Thibault, and thank you also for reminding all of us and participants of this special treatment that you gave to the OECD by sharing your data. We appreciated the trust, and we used extensively your data to balance and confirm the data that we got from governments. And I think this is a very healthy collaboration that we would like to continue. And congratulations also for the Forum on Information and Democracy. The way we look at civic space is exactly in the context of the broader information system and ecosystem, in fact, and its link with democracy. So there as well, our paths will cross in the future. So thank you for being such an amazing partner. Speaking of amazing partners, I couldn't not give the floor now to Sharan Nivas from the Open Society Foundation that has been with the OECD from the very beginning in supporting us, encouraging us, and providing also expertise in the creation of the report. Sharan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ale. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. I want to take this occasion to express my congratulations to the OECD, in particular, the Directorate of the Public Governance, to Ale, to Claire and their team for putting together what is really a monumental and landmark report on the protection and promotion of civic space. At the outset, I want to note that one of the strengths for me of this report is its ambition to support both members and non-members to raise their standards and improve their policies on safeguarding civic space. And the fact that 52 governments, including 33 OECD members, voluntarily shared their data that enabled the analysis that forms the basis of report, to me shows enthusiasm to engage at this crucial inflection point where democracy and democracies are being challenged by authoritarians and autocrats the world over. So civic space, far from being just an agglomeration of certain fundamental rights guaranteed by law, is now recognized in this report as a prerequisite for democracies to flourish and deliver for their people. At the same time, I am concerned about three trends that the report identified that I'd like to lift. Firstly, that 20% of OECD members are experiencing a decline in areas related to the protection of civic space, that online civic space is increasingly affected by the prevalence of disinformation and hate speech designed to exclude and silence people, especially women and minorities, and that there is an insufficient protection of protesters by law enforcement, as Clément mentioned, as well as police violence used against protesters in some contexts. In this context, I wholeheartedly wish to support the recommendations of the report, and in particular, the very contemporary calls to protect and facilitate the right to protest, the emphasis on the need to protect human rights defenders, journalists, and whistleblowers, and the need to counter hate speech and misinformation, and the need, finally, for all countries to make greater efforts to address the prevalence of SLAPP suits in their jurisdiction, and to proactively introduce legislation to counter these. These recommendations align with our own strategic priorities at Open Society Foundations to combat authoritarianism through stemming the tide of disinformation, countering the abuse of spyware and public security laws, and of course, to protect human rights defenders. Colleagues, we are, as you know, living in multiple global crises, from the climate crisis to COVID-19, the invasion of Ukraine, and an alarming cost of living crisis and rising inflation. Women in Iran, people in China, and others are trying to engage on these issues through protest, through association. And as my fellow co-panelists have mentioned, the temptation for states to respond to these crises by imposing states of emergency and restricting civic space is high. But this temptation to crack down on protests and strikes should be avoided. And I think that is a point that this report makes, that vibrant civic participation is the beating heart of a democracy for its people. So I applaud the report for making this link through evidence and data and highlighting how civic space can help improve government effectiveness, responsiveness, and ultimately trust in government. In this great contest we are seeing between democracy and authoritarianism, it is my hope that the OECD and its member states, by lifting civic space as a key pillar of its reinforcing democracy initiative, can create the platforms for further discussion on how we can implement some of these recommendations. So in that, I'd like to end by saying, I hope that this report is not an end product, but one that can serve as a candle, as a compass, as a manual, and as a compendium for innovation and best practice for both member and non-member states of the OECD to jointly engage with civil society, with private philanthropy, to jointly expand civic space online and offline, to safeguard democracy at home and effectively promote it abroad. And to this end, we hope to be a partner in the continued work moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ran. And at the end of this event, I will tell you a little bit more about the next steps. But I like very much the metaphor of this report being a candle, but also a compass. So it's not only about good things and light, but it's also showing the way on how to improve and how to do things better. And again, when we're talking about doing things better, I'm very happy to introduce you Katju Holkeri from Finland, who is one of those countries that clearly is doing a lot in the field of civic space, and also one of the first country that has submitted itself to an OECD civic space scan. We'll talk more about this later. Katju is also the chair of the Working Party on Open Government, under which authority this report has been written. And I can also say personally that without her support, all this would have never happened at OECD. So thank you very much, Katju. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would of course like to join the others in thanking from the bottom of my heart and congratulating Alessandro Bellantoni, Claire McEvoy, and the whole OECD team and the OECD Secretariat for this important achievement. This is really today a result of over a decade of commitment to advancing the principles of open government within the OECD, but also beyond. I also would like to here express my gratitude to all the delegates of the OECD Working Party on Open Government who have really championed this work from the start. And as Alec mentioned, as the chair of the OECD Working Party on Open Government, it has really been a great pleasure to firsthand witness and to support the development of this area of work on the protection and promotion of civic space since the Observatory of the Civic Space was founded in 2019. But like I said, this is only the beginning, and I greatly look forward to us all using this report to turn the tide on current trends and to really collectively raise the standards and to discover the ways to strengthen civic space at our national levels. I would also like to emphasize that we are really proud that Finland has long recognized the importance of this area of work. And in fact, many of you may know that was mentioned already here, that Finland was the first country to undertake the OECD Civic Space Scan last year, 2021. And it assessed the enabling environment for civil society and citizen participation in public decision making. And the scan also examined issues such as social inclusion of marginalized groups, discrimination, gender equality, and the impact of COVID-19, among many other things. And there was truly excellent collaboration between the OECD Secretariat. Thank you once more for that. That was really a joy. And between us, the government of Finland, and the wider civil society in our country. And I think this was really all essential for the comprehensive report that followed for Finland. But there was also strong support for the scan findings, the recommendations in Finland, so that the Ministry of Finance set up an interministerial preparatory group to take the implementation of the recommendations forward. And this is, of course, also very important that we do not just read, but we also act upon the recommendations. Some of you may wonder why a country such as Finland, when we so often rank at the top of the international rankings that are related to civic freedom or press freedom, rule of law, citizen participation, and more, would be interested in such a civic space scan, such an assessment. But we really recognize in Finland that the protection of civic space needs to be consistently nurtured, and really that the scan identified a host of measures that our government should take. and is taking now to protect civic space. I work myself for the public governance reforms, and from that perspective, I would like to say that our reforms do not have any relevance whatsoever if we are not able to protect and promote civic space. And as the report now that we have at hand now, the comparative report itself illustrates, this civic space protection cannot be taken for granted in any of our countries, given the fast changing world that we live in, and especially considering the transnational influences and cross-border challenges that really put pressure on civic space, as others have already mentioned several times. And because of this, we were so delighted about the civic space scan done in Finland, but really also truly delighted to see that other countries such as Brazil, Romania, Portugal, Morocco, and Tunisia are following suit by also having assessments of their civic space undertaken by the OECD. So this is really, I congratulate these countries. And then I would really like to just say that the value added of the report for the OECD member countries and the like-minded countries is really manifold. So the OECD has already a growing number of legal standards for its members in areas related to civic space, for example, on open government and promoting citizen participation, including for underrepresented groups, participation of youth in decision-making, and enabling civil society and civic space in partner countries as part of the development cooperation. And building on this all previous work, this report really provides a comprehensive overview on the existing practices in the realm of civic space. And the comparative aspect of the report will really greatly support our countries to identify the areas that need improvement, to learn about the good practices from our peers, and to use the evidence-based arguments that are now at our disposal in this report to push for the progress on our national levels. And the key measures outlined really throughout the report in particular really serve as a beacon for our countries when we start these efforts and continue these efforts to safeguard the civic space. So all in all, each and every one of our countries, be we OECD countries or partner or other countries, we really need to do more. And only by prioritizing the protection and promotion of civic space can we really achieve then our joint ambitions for more open, representative, and citizen-centered democratic governance. And really, I just want to, in the end, once more, thank the OECD team for this remarkable achievement that really then helps us to achieve these goals. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katju, and thank you for representing so well the OECD membership that has been behind this work, and also for highlighting that while this report looks at international trends, the instrument that the OECD uses to zoom in at the national level are the scans. And Finland paved the way for these scans, and we really hope that countries will continue to ask for them, because there is where we move from general trends to actual implementation and impact. And now to finish this amazing panel, I'm happy to introduce a friend, a funder, and a partner of this work. Elena has been not only supporting us with enthusiasm, but also by raising the bar every time we were talking to her. And I think thanks to her pressure and demand and expectations, our report has been improved. And hopefully, thanks to people like her, this report will also be used at country level to make changes. So Elena Hoff-Bauer is the International Program Director on Civic Engagement and Government, and the Director of Mexico and Central America of the Ford Foundation, and will close this list of speakers of today's launch. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is such an honor to be here, and it is such a moment of celebration to see this report see the light and to know the many hours of work that went into it by so many parties and so many people. So as such, congratulations to the OECD for this first report and its solid evidence base, which we hope will inaugurate a regular examination of the conditions of civic space and hopefully a race to the top among member and partner countries engaged in it. The report points out the many different elements that civic space encompasses, from essential freedoms, including media freedom and civic space in the digital world, to the enabling environment for civil society to play a role that can be openly critical of governments. Civic space is a key intersectional issue for all governments and societies that believe in democracy. And we should not be fooled by thinking that this is a fringe issue. This is at the core of the fight for democracy and for vibrant democracies around the world. Many elements are key in expanding civic space, but I want to highlight only a couple of them. Press freedom, as the report well illustrates, has been in decline and conditions have deteriorated over the last years. The killing of journalists is the most egregious expression of this trend, which intentionally undermines freedom of expression and reduces the space for healthy engagement. The killing of journalists have to be met with determination by governments by reducing the levels of impunity and raising the cost for these crimes. And Portugal, as such, is a good example in setting steps or taking steps to do so. The report points out also the need for lighter regulations of civil society organizations for their registration and operation. There is an opportunity for OECD member and partner countries not only to improve their practices regarding their own civil society, but also extend to facilitate the registration and operation of civil society in exile in OECD countries. Unfortunately, the number of activists, social justice leaders, and organizations that are forced to go into exile is on the rise and goes hand in hand with the killing of social justice leaders. Solidarity is essential not only to save their lives, but also to ensure that they can continue playing the critical role in the defense of human rights, the environment, land, and democracy that led them to be in danger in the first place. The report also highlights the use of SLAPP suits. But there are other ways in which companies are responsible for civic space violations. We need to work on creating deliberate strategies to engage with the private sector around civic space issues, and OECD member and partner countries must consider adopting mandatory human rights due diligence laws at the national level that include language on civic space and protection of social justice leaders. This is essential because attacks against social justice leaders are attacks against the core of democratic values and the core of the fight for democracy that is playing out in different places. We celebrate this first report and hope that it will expand the interest of governments in civic space as a key central element for vibrant democracies. We recommend that OECD members and partner governments take proactive steps to undergo focused civic space scans, as did Finland, in order to understand and address the limitations that operate in their own countries, and also to take steps to set up focal points in governments that can monitor civic space and work across agencies. Civic space at this moment is essential for democracy around the world. And democracy around the world is essential for all of the interests that bring together so many agencies and so many people, be it from economic development issues like OECD itself, or human rights essential fights and standards around the world. So this is the first step in what we hope will be a long long chain of steps and activities and actions taken to really bring civic space to the center as the ground in which all of us can influence governments, play with governments, and raise our voices in order to be heard and play a role in how decisions are made. Thank you very much, Alessandro, Claire, and everybody in the OECD for bringing this report to light and thus concluding the first step of many steps along this road.
Well, thank you, Elena, for also putting this perspective of civic space being one step of a much longer path towards renewed democracies, or the future of democracy, as we like to call it. And that's exactly the way we would like to see it. Now, it's 4:14, so we've only have 1 minute, so clearly we cannot take the questions, but colleagues that have produced so many good questions, we have discussed in parallel, and we have decided to actually answer your questions and publish them in our Medium channel called Participo. We will also ask Elena, Cacio, Clément, Thibaut, Gillian, and Michael, if they want to contribute. We'll share a draft and see if they want to add their voices, because these questions are important and we don't want them to go to waste, but also because, as Elena said, this has to be a conversation. We would like this conversation to continue. Please also, colleagues, put in the chat the link to our newsletter. We will want to have a community around this report and around the activities we will do to disseminate its recommendation and to put pressure to governments and civil society as well to use them to improve and promote and protect civic space in their countries. We discussed quickly about the fact that this is only one of many things that the OECD will do. The first thing we will do in 2023 is to transform this 300 pages report. Don't forget there are the highlights, it's a summary of it, but still this massive report into a practical guide for policymakers on protecting and promoting civic space. We really want to transform these high-level recommendations into practical things that public officials need to do. And I think Elena very well connected civic space with participatory practices. Civic space is an enabler for inclusive democracy, and we want to help policymakers and public officials to actually walk the talk. So this is the first thing we will do in 2023. We will also translate the highlights of the report in French and Spanish, so that more people will be able to read it in their language or a language they know, which will facilitate their use. And then there will be a lot of focus on increasing the number of civic space scans at national level, to bring this platform that at the moment is global to the national level, so that civil society, non-governmental stakeholders can actually meet and talk with their governments facilitated by the OECD. We will also organize regional events, so we'll be in Brussels, hopefully in Mexico, and in other parts of the world. I've seen colleagues from Tunisia and Morocco in the chat. I salute them. Their scans will also be published soon, and we will be having events there. So thank you very much, all of you, for staying with us until now. Thank you very much for your interest in this work. Nothing would make us happier than if you actually use this report to improve your, to complement your activities at the national level, your advocacy work, your research. And please do get in touch for any idea of collaboration. We are happy to be, again, a platform between existing actors like the United Nations or RSF or FRA or FORD or OSF and our member governments and the governments that engage with us in this report. Merci beaucoup pour l'audience francophone qui nous a suivis jusqu'à maintenant.
Many thanks for the French-speaking countries who also participated.
Of the observatory. Congratulations to Claire, Denise, but also Sophie, Mary, Josh, and all the team of the OECD. And thank you, Cacio, for being our captain of the ship on open government at the OECD. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you for being with us.